All right, so this is the last lecture we're doing on Mesopotamia and just kind of covering more directly. We did a little bit indirectly of Mesopotamian religion. Um, so some scholars on this part of the world see an evolution that there were initially spirits or gods, noumena, that presided over things, and that they would eventually take an animal form, okay, and then rise into becoming anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphic is a more common term than theriomorphic. Anthropos in Greek means like human, right? So taking on the form of a human, right? Okay, so there's this idea that there was an evolution of a development and how the natural world and spirits then would take shape into becoming like the gods that we know. I think that this is always going to be a little bit debatable, or a lot debatable, in terms of like actually knowing. In certain cultures, we can see things more clearly. In other things, it's a little bit more vague. Okay. For instance, what's interesting though, like we find in some of the texts in Sumerian, Abzu, fresh water, it was not created and always there. I mean, isn't that interesting, right? I mean, scientists, some claim that there could be an energy that was never created and always there, which led to the creation of life. And people who believe in God say that God was not created and was always there. And so we might have talked about this before, but right, the idea is that, okay, God has to have a creator because something, the idea is that there has to be a creator because something can't come from nothing. That's the usual argument. But then who made God? And then for many in the religious world, that's the mystery, and God always was. And so if you think about it, whether someone's an atheist, materialist creationist, or believes in God, so everywhere somebody has to stop where something is not created. But that doesn't fit our logic, and so it hurts our head no matter which way we want to spin it. And I think that it's interesting that ancient humans kind of approach the topic of something, the idea of something not being created and always being there. Anyways, thought I'd just point that out. So we then have a Babylonian myth of creation that has its own kind of ideas, such as what I was just talking about. It's just interesting in the Bible that we also start off with water, and God's ruach, or his spirit, hovers above it. And so I don't know. We see, we see certain themes that are still there stylistically. So again, here I kind of talking about this in the Enuma Elish, in this creation myth that's in the library of Ashurbanipals from the 6th century BCE. He says, when in the height heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, and the primeval Apsu who beget them, and Chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both, their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. When the gods, none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies. Then were created the gods in the midst of heaven. So here, gods are created, right? Now, then we look at this other text in 21st century BC. It says, then Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu, changed the speech in their mouths, contention into the speech of man until speech of man that until had been one. Now we look at Genesis chapters 1 through 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. And again, we talked about the Spirit of God, the Ruach, hovering over the space of the waters. Then we go down to Genesis, kind of comparing this section. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and mix up their language. I don't know if you can see this now on there. so they do not understand each other. So again, the idea of humans having one speech that then gets split up, the idea of this the kind of quietness, almost the subtleness of there being these universal forces that are kind of then going to again, I hate to use the word evolve, but into creation, has a similar feel, right? They're different. There's different messages going on here, but they have a similar feel, right? Okay. So who are some of the gods? There's An or Anu, god of heaven, perhaps the main god of the pantheon prior to the to 2500 BCE, and then eventually that god's influence waned. Enlil was the air god and leader of the pantheon from at least 2500 BCE, and he was glorified as the father of the gods, the king of heaven and the earth, the king of all lands. And he's also banished to the netherworld for his rape of Ninlil, his intended bride. And it's interesting, right? We see like with the Greeks and sometimes in these Mesopotamian stories, gods don't behave always godly in the way we would think that they would have a higher moral standard than us, which I think is kind of interesting. Ishtar, or Inanna, she is the goddess of love, procreation, and war. She is armed with a quiver and bow, and she has temple prostitutes of both genders, and often accompanied by a lion. It's interesting, the idea of temple prostitutes. Even in the Bible, when they're mentioned, it's interesting because they're called Kodeshim, or like the holy ones. And they're not supposed to be doing that, but the idea of their sacredness mixed in with the idea of being a prostitute for a god or a goddess. Again, in the Bible, it's condemned, but it still uses the word Kodesh in there, which is the holy. Now, I mean, maybe that's what it's trying to say, making an inference of this being linked to a religious practice. But I think it's very interesting that that's there. And if you look in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the priestess of Ishtar has 3 days straight of pretty rigorous sex with this wild man to tame him. And afterwards, he can no longer be like an animal because now he has a mind like a man because he had sex with a woman. And this was seen as taking the animal out of him. Don't we usually in our society, we say they're doing it like animals. Like it's like it's being very bestial. Here, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, this humanizes. That's an interesting approach, right? That's different. So Tammuz, or Dumuzi, a demigod, he's also mentioned in the Bible. He's given charge of stables and sheepfolds. He's Inanna's husband. In life, he was the shepherd king of Uruk. Okay. So the biblical word Tammuz is also mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14. The term denotes a Babylonian god and the sin of idolatry, which caused the destruction of the first temple. And then there's also the month of Tammuz, as referred to as the fourth month in Jeremiah 39:1. Maybe it's a little bit like our calendars with our pagan Nordic gods mixed in, like Thursday, Thor's day, right? I don't know. Very strange. Okay, so Epic of Gilgamesh is important. I highly recommend reading it. It's interesting on so many levels. One, that story about the temple prostitute being sent to humanize this man, this wild man, was interesting. Gilgamesh is supposed to be 2/3 god and 1/3 human. He's a tyrannical king and he's also a hero. He's an anti-hero. You read this and it's like, he's not really a good guy. But then he kind of becomes better through the end of it. He starts off very bad. I mean, even taking women on the first night before their husbands get them, in the kingdom. I mean, that kind of thing. It's crazy. So anyhow, here's some other interesting aspects that are linked and similar to the Bible. In Epic of Gilgamesh, as his friend is dying, he says, "There's no gold statue that can save me from sickness," which is a strange line, right? But now notice in Numbers 21, 6 through 8, it says, "Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, 'We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us.' So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, 'Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live.' So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake or looked at the bronze snake, they lived." Now, one mentioned bronze and the other gold. I think what's significant is this idea of staring at some sort of golden statue of some type to be saved from sickness. Again, you see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and here we see that in the Book of Numbers in the Torah. Interesting, I think, to point out. And then the flood, last. The flood account in the Epic of Gilgamesh has the closest similarities to the biblical account of the flood of all. You can just look that up online, but I'm just reading one section. It says, I loaded onto her all that I had, gold and all the living things, my family, my kin, the beasts of the field, both wild and tame. And he talks about in this flood. At the end it says, "On the seventh day dawned, I loosened a dove and let her go. She flew away, but finding no resting place, she returned. Then I loosened the swallow, and she flew away, but finding no resting place, she returned. I loosed a raven. She saw the waters and retreated. She ate. She flew around. She cawed, and she did not come back." If you've read this story, you'll recognize some of these themes. So I encourage you to look at that, and that was very brief and cursory, but I hope you got enough out of it, and we're going to move on to the next section.